I think, I hope this is on, I think Leslie and I were chosen to be buried in the middle of the afternoon so that no one would sleep. And I hope to do that. Maybe not as successfully as you did. I was just on my tenterhooks. But I have an interesting job to do with you. Some of you, is this working? I am going to suggest to you a different view of literacy than some of you have had. Some of you have been with me before in talks here. I am now at the Center for Dyslexia, Diverse Learners, and Social Justice at UCLA, where we share a mission like everyone in this room. Not only do we think that education is a basic human right, it is my job today to talk about how literacy is the foundation for that basic human right everywhere. And I'm going to use a metaphor that actually Tommy Katsir gave to me through Robert Darnton, that this moment is a hinge moment in our culture. We have gone through different forms of transitions, but in this transition, we're moving from a written culture to a digital culture. And within that, we need to really look, and in my area of cognitive neuroscience, we need to look at what literacy is. For literacy, quite literally and physiologically, changes the brain of every individual, which changes society, which ultimately can change the future of our species. Now, the point of this talk, however, within that hinge moment, is that everything is literally changing under our fingertips and has been. I'd even suggest to you that the hinge moment is no more. We are on the other side of that culture. Now, this has both great promise, and my colleagues tomorrow, Sebastian, and there are various, Birgit will be part of that, Birgit and others. We know that there's both great promise inside that digital culture, especially with regard to literacy, but also threats. And part of my discomforting job today is to ask you to be not unlike F. Scott Fitzgerald, who said that the test of a first-rate mind is to hold two opposing thoughts and not go crazy. And indeed, there are those well before F. Scott Fitzgerald who tackled that problem. And I begin with Nicholas of Cusano, who literally looked at what was happening centuries before us and said, how do we resolve a coincidence of opposites of believable truths? And what I'm going to be suggesting to you today is that there are both great promise with regard to reading and literacy on screens and digital media, but also particular threats, literally that will end as a threat to democracy. And here I will actually return to you. I'm going to be using an unusual approach that I've never used before. I have studied Nicholas of Cusano, but I have never studied Romano Guardini until preparation for this talk. I'm using Romano Guardini because those of you who have read Laudato Si, you know that Pope Francis was very much involved in Guardini's thinking about what do we do when we have two opposing forces. And what Guardini was saying is that we have to have knowledge about both. We have to have research about both and use a transcending lens, not unlike what Nicholas of Cusa said. But Pope Francis actually suggested that when we have opposing forces, that we need to try to develop reconciliatory thought. And so a part of me is going to refresh those of you. I look at Sonia, who reminded me that she was there in my first presentation for Bread and Brain, where I described to you research that we've conducted in various countries using digital media with children who have absolutely no schools. We began in Ethiopia. The figures on literacy, as Jeff and as David this morning talked to us are stunning. We really have at least 200 million children, at least, who will be non-functional in terms of literacy. I've been developing with the Curious Learning Project a way of making apps that curate the reading brain. And we've been working in Ethiopia. Those of you who may remember my talk about the lion boy, he's the one with he is now reading. So we have developed deployments in South Africa, Uganda, India, also rural United States. And now we have taken a slightly different approach. My colleagues there are developing a particular app called Feed the Monster, and I'm only going to say 1 minute about it. We're now able to give children an opportunity to learn the precursors of literacy. Basically, this is just the beginning. Our other apps are going to be even more extended, but we're basically able, through 22 hours of play, to give about 2 months worth of literacy learning. Now, this talk is not going to be about that. That's what I have given talks with you before. This is about the other side, and that's the perils that we need to consider as a society, and each of us, how we are changing, and that can be as important as what we read. How we read is what the story, if you will, the narrative for today will be with you. And it begins for me always with, how do we take the reading brain circuit and use it to understand what's going on as a medium? Every one of us needs to know we were never born to read. There's not a single gene in your heads for reading. It's a circuit that must be constructed. And those of you who speak Chinese or Japanese, you have an absolutely beautiful right visual cortex that the rest of us don't have. The reality is that our brain reflects the writing system. It reflects how we are educated, what goes into that early education, but it also reflects the affordances, the characteristics of the medium. Now, my colleague Patricia Greenfield has said this: every medium has its cost and weaknesses, but the cost in the digital medium seems to be deep processing. Now, Marcelo talked this morning just very briefly about literacy, but then he used the more important term, deep literacy. And this is what I have been working on most recently, deep reading. What is it that goes into the kind of thinking that we want every democratic citizen to have? Part of my paper for you goes more into detail on here, but for today, I only want to emphasize 2 aspects to that circuit that we absolutely need to preserve. Not unlike Leslie, and not unlike Tommy Katsir tomorrow, the importance of empathy, the ability to take on the perspective of others, is a moral laboratory like few others. Now, when Barack Obama did an interview with the great novelist Marilyn Robinson, he said it was the novel, it was stories that taught him what was right and wrong, not black and white. To which Marilyn Robinson said, the trend towards seeing others as sinister is the greatest threat to democracy, and therein lies the function of the novel and the novelist. Marilyn Robinson also said something very important to those of us in neuroscience who are saying, what is the apex of reading? What is the furthest point? And it is an integration like few others. Within this, critical analysis and empathy are playing major roles. And Marilyn Robinson said this that I thought was so important. It's a different way of looking at what we want as the apex of reading. If God has taken pleasure in his creation, some part is in your best idea, your most disciplined thinking on whatever is true, honorable, just, pleasing, and worthy of praise. The discernment of truth is what goes on when you, as a reader and thinker, allocate time to it. Quite literally, it is a dance between your right and left frontal lobes. It is hypothesis making a generation. If we do not give time, if we don't allocate those precious seconds, we are not empathic, and we will not have the time to be critically analytic with great consequences. Now here, I'm going to make Marcelo look. This is Thomas Aquinas. I'm using Thomas Aquinas as the basis for looking at all of the things that go into reading, because one of the things that he said, you may not remember this, in the G.K. Chesterton biography, he was asked, what are you most grateful for? And he said, I am most grateful that I understood every page I ever read. What a wonderful tribute to, we wish all of us. But I use Thomas Aquinas because there is something that goes beyond even critical analysis in the rest of the circuit. And that's something that we need to think about as a society, as a culture. And that's the contemplative function. Our ability to reflect about what we are reading and thinking. And it is here that I use Aristotle. Aristotle said that we could judge a culture by how it pursues three lives: the life of activity and productivity, the life of enjoyment, and the life of contemplation. I suggest to you that, like the good society, the good reader needs three lives, and we are losing the third. All of us, each one of us who spends 10 to 12 hours a day on a screen, well, what is the evidence we are building up on the effects of the screen? And the effects are at every age. Now remember, I'm asking you to be the F. Scott Fitzgerald here. I am as much interested in what apps can do and what programming can do to be helpful as I am to understand the effects. Only when we understand both sides can we move forward. But the effects on early childhood are beginning to become ominous. We now have data from various sources that those children who spend all this time on screens are actually less developed in language. This is, as we go just slightly older, we are seeing clinically higher levels of attention issues. Our children are more quickly bored. They have this low level threshold. But today I only want to emphasize one piece of evidence, and that's our young adults. There was a meta-analysis recently done by the e-Read network here in Europe. And they took 50 studies in Europe and Israel, 171,000 young people. One task: read the same story in two mediums, and then we'll ask questions. That's all they did. Now I'm going to ask you one thing. You see right here, it says the print was superior to the screen for comprehension. Okay, that's 171,000. Now I'm going to ask you to raise your hands. In a sub-analysis of only the last few years, when our young adults are basically digital natives, then what's the answer? Are they better on the screen, or are they better in print? And I want you to vote. Who votes that our young adults, the natives, are now better on the screen for comprehension? How many of you vote? Okay, how many of you vote for print? Okay, those of you who are still awake, you're right. You are right. This is counterintuitive. But the reality is, and Rockefeller Ackerman from Israel did a study. Why do they think? It's because they think, because they are faster on the screen, that they're better in thinking. Speed. This is a false, if speed does not lead to illumination in the reading brain circuit. I'm not asking you to be slow readers, but I'm asking you to be purposeful. And here's where I look at you, all of you. The evidence is right there, from eye movement from Berlin to San Jose State. We are all becoming skimmers. Now, if you were really going to analyze yourself, most of you do an F, or a Z, and then you're done. Whether it's a paper, it's a paragraph, you're skimming, you're browsing, you're word spotting. Some of you do that during concerts. It's horrible. I analyzed this at the LA Symphony. Who's doing that? But the reality is we're all so distracted and we're all so bombarded by things we have to read that it's become a defense mechanism. But it has implications. The implications certainly by Italo Calvino years ago was saying that we are beginning to flatten language. T.S. Eliot said it even much earlier, and this is part of my new work. Where is the wisdom lost in knowledge? Where is the knowledge lost in information? And here is a pivotal slide for this group. The implications, if we are not giving time to be critically analytic and empathic, is that we have less capacity to understand complexity. And here we need only realize that in the United States, policy is being made on Twitter. To realize the failure, this is the failure of complexity to reach the citizen. There is also a failure for poetry, for beauty. How do we have time when we're browsing and word spotting to appreciate the most used, the absolute perfect word that author tried to give? Some of you weren't exactly trying to be perfect. You were using an effort that can be lost when we are only word spotting. But perhaps as important as anything else, will we learn to feel empathy in the same way? Will we ultimately become more susceptible, as we all know we are, all of us including, to false information when you skim and browse and word spot? But my worry is that the population at large is becoming so much more susceptible to false information, false truths repeated over and over, make a representation a neuronal trace. The discernment of truth requires time in that reading brain circuit, or we will be not only susceptible to false truths, false fears, false hopes, but demagoguery. It is a recipe for threats to a democratic society. And here I look at you, Professor Rogers. Umberto Eco and Cardinal Martini said this: the delicate game of democracy provides for a dialectic of opinions, and such exchanges will expand the collective moral conscience. We need perspectives of others, and we are losing them in our bombardment, if you will, of information. Now, Martha Nussbaum said this: it would be catastrophic to become a nation of technically competent people who have lost the ability to think critically, to examine themselves, and to respect the humanity and diversity of others. This is us. This is this wonderful body of people, and it's so exciting for me to just learn from all of you. But we must be careful of who we are all becoming. Now, another colleague, Sherry Turkle, leads me to my final 3 slides. There are no binaries here. If we are binary thinkers, if we think, oh, it has to be all print, or oh, it has to be all screen, we will lose the point that I am really trying to make, that it is knowledge that will lead us out. And Sherry Turkle said, we transgress not because we try to build the new, but because we do not allow ourselves to consider what it disrupts or diminishes. What we disrupt in ourselves is one thing, but all of you have a very fashioned reading brain circuit. What if it is not developed? These are our most vulnerable. Our young are our most vulnerable. And so we have to have the knowledge bases. And Birgit and I were talking about, there are roles that we must have research take to understand what is happening as we build this next epoch. Now, I am using Romano Guardini, and I am using Pope Francis at this moment to suggest there is a reconciliation between the digital and the print in a proposal I am trying to build and make and write about for a biliterate, deep reading brain. And it has two parallels. And you will know this, Carla, because of your knowledge of Vygotsky and the psychologist. It's not unlike Vygotsky's parallel processing of thought and language. But in this case, we're building an entire developmental sequence on print for the development of reading and deep reading, and simultaneously building digital skills, programming and coding in our young, but separately, so that print, with all its tactile and emotive, all these aspects, that's how we build deep reading. And then we need teachers who are capable of pulling them all together so that deep reading is taught on the screens, the deep reading processes. So this is a first proposal for this biliterate brain. But I'm going to end with two quotes. One, again, from Marilyn Robinson. The greatest test ever made of human wisdom and decency may very well come to this generation or the next. We must teach and learn broadly and seriously. My hope is that we will find a way so that deep reading, deep thinking, and democratic citizens will be the manifestation of our shared knowledge. It will not be one medium, but it will be one goal, and that is deep thinking with critical analysis, empathy, and ultimately the contemplative function. And I end with a teacher of mine. Father John Dunn from Notre Dame said this: wisdom is not contemplation alone, not action alone, but contemplation in action. And that's what I wish for everyone in this room. I thank you for letting me be part of your 2 days. Thank you so much.